Fluorescent lights hummed a high, broken pitch in the clinic waiting room. Jesse pressed his thumb against his lower abdomen, feeling the slight, unfamiliar firmness there. 2 lines on a cheap plastic stick, a $50,000 debt tightening around his throat. Outside, a black sedan idled against the curb, its exhaust curling into the damp autumn air, waiting to collect him. He wasn't a tragic hero. He was just an Omega with a maxed-out credit card, sold to pay another man's mistakes. Leather seats always squeaked at the worst times. Jesse sat rigid in the back of the sedan, the stiff upholstery biting into his thin denim jeans. The car smelled of synthetic pine air freshener, a desperate attempt to mask the driver's cheap, peppery cologne. It wasn't working. The clashing odors crawled up Jesse's throat, mixing with the greasy, rolling nausea of his first trimester. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic residue of the tap water he'd choked down that morning. Rogelio had signed the papers 3 days ago. Jesse's ex-alpha. The man had smelled like sour beer, stale tobacco, and sheer pathetic cowardice when he finally confessed. $50,000 in gambling debts, wiped clean by a private holding company. In exchange, the company acquired Rogelio's only valuable asset, his bonded Omega. The bond was legally dissolved on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Jesse discovered he was pregnant. Now it was Friday, and he was being delivered. The sedan lurched to a halt. The driver didn't open the door for him. This wasn't a fairy tale, and Jesse wasn't a prince. He pushed the heavy door open himself, his boots hitting the cracked asphalt of a private underground parking garage. The air down here was thick, smelling of motor oil, damp concrete, and the sharp bite of ozone. "Elevators this way," the driver grunted, pointing a thick finger toward a steel door. Jesse didn't nod. He just walked. His lower back ached, a dull, rhythmic throbbing that synced perfectly with the pulse in his temples. The penthouse office didn't look like a boardroom. It looked like a sterile containment facility. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the gray city skyline, but the light filtering in was weak and filtered. Behind a massive slate desk sat Abner Freeman. Abner was an enigma. The classification was rare, whispered about in hushed tones, usually associated with genetic anomalies and unstable temperaments. Jesse had expected a monster. Instead, he saw a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. Abner's dark hair was neatly trimmed, but beginning to gray at the temples. His suit was expensive, yet it hung on his broad frame as if he found the fabric physically exhausting to wear. When Abner looked up, his eyes were flat, the color of bruised slate. Then, the scent hit Jesse. It wasn't romantic. It was suffocating. Crushed cedar, heavy and dense, underscored by the terrifying atmospheric pressure of a coming thunderstorm. It made the roots of Jesse's teeth ache. His Omega biology screamed at him to submit, to drop his gaze, to bare his neck. Jesse crossed his arms over his chest, digging his fingernails into his own biceps until it hurt enough to keep him grounded. "Jesse Cavalier," Abner said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the glass of the windows. "That's the name on the receipt," Jesse replied. His voice cracked slightly on the last syllable. He hated himself for it. Abner didn't smile. He sifted through a manila folder on his desk. The sound of paper scraping against paper was deafening in the quiet room. "You were acquired because Rogelio Bell owed my syndicate a substantial amount of money, but you were specifically selected for this household because of your medical records." Jesse stiffened. He instinctively pressed a hand to his flat stomach, the rough fabric of his sweater offering no real protection. "You know, my doctors are thorough," Abner said, leaning back in his leather chair. The chair groaned under his weight. "You are roughly 7 weeks pregnant. The sire is Rogelio Bell." "He doesn't know," Jesse snapped, the words out before he could stop them. "And I want it in writing that he never finds out." "Done," Abner said instantly, waving a hand as if dismissing a fly. "I have no interest in Bell. I have an interest in your biology, Mr. Cavalier. You are pregnant. Your body is currently flooded with high concentrations of nesting pheromones, specifically designed to soothe and protect offspring. Jesse frowned, his cynical mind struggling to catch up. You bought a pregnant Omega? For pheromones? Abner sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For a second, the overwhelming Enigma aura fractured, revealing a bone-deep exhaustion. I have 4 sons, quadruplets. They are 5 years old. They are also, like me, Enigmas. Jesse felt the blood drain from his face. 4 Enigma children. Enigmas were notoriously difficult to raise. Their biological instincts were territorial, aggressive, and overwhelming even as toddlers. They routinely hospitalized standard beta nannies and drove alpha tutors into stress-induced comas. They have broken the arms of 2 caretakers this month alone, Abner stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Standard Omegas trigger their territorial aggression. Betas are too weak to handle their output. Alphas challenge them, resulting in violence. But a pregnant Omega smells like a sanctuary, Jesse finished, the realization settling heavily in his gut. It was a biological hack, a calculated, bloodless transaction. You want me as a walking, breathing pacifier for your feral kids. I want you as a step-parent, Abner corrected softly. If your pheromones can regulate their development, your debt is permanently erased. You will be compensated handsomely. You will receive top-tier medical care for your own child. All I ask is that you keep my sons from tearing this city apart. Jesse looked at the man. He smelled the ozone, the cedar, the desperate crushing weight of a father entirely out of his depth. Jesse was 24, deeply in debt, pregnant with a coward's child, and standing in front of a man who could crush his skull with one hand. Do I get dental? Jesse asked. Abner's slate eyes blinked once. Yes. Fine, Jesse said, dropping his arms. Let's go meet the monsters. The Freeman estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural marvel. It sat on the edge of the city, a sprawling mass of concrete, black steel, and tinted glass. The tires of Abner's SUV crunched over the gravel driveway, the sound sharp and rhythmic. Inside, the house echoed. The hardwood floors were spotless, reflecting the harsh recessed lighting overhead. It smelled of lemon-scented industrial cleaner and cold air. There were no pictures on the walls, no stray shoes by the door. They are in the West Wing, Abner said, shrugging off his heavy wool coat. He didn't offer to take Jesse's. Jesse followed, his worn sneakers squeaking faintly against the pristine wood. His stomach gave another threatening roll, reacting to the synthetic lemon smell. He dug his nails into his palms, forcing the nausea down. He wasn't going to throw up in front of this man. As they approached a set of heavy reinforced double doors, the air changed. The temperature seemed to drop, and a harsh, chaotic scent bled through the wood. It smelled like raw, uninsulated wire sparking against damp earth. It was jagged. It made the hairs on Jesse's arms stand up. Abner paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. They are energetic today. He pushed the door open. The playroom was massive, but it looked like a war zone. Bookshelves were toppled. Expensive educational wooden toys were splintered across the rug. In the center of the chaos were 4 boys. They looked identical, messy dark hair, pale skin, and the same terrifying bruised slate eyes as their father. When the door opened, all 4 heads snapped toward it in eerie unison. The oldest-looking one, or at least the one standing the tallest, bared his small teeth. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a 5-year-old. The pheromones in the room spiked, thick and aggressive, slamming into Jesse like a physical wall. Threat, intruder, danger. Jesse stumbled back a half step, his hand flying to his stomach. His Omega instincts flared, not with submission, but with a sudden, violent surge of maternal defense. The bitter scent of bruised orange peels and old, dry paper exploded from Jesse's skin, saturating the air. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of calm. Down, stop, safe. The boys froze, the growling cut off instantly. The tallest boy blinked, his small nose twitching as he inhaled. The aggression in the room didn't vanish, but it faltered, turning confused and muddy. "Leo, Toby, Sam, Wyatt," Abner said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "This is Jesse." Jesse didn't crouch down. He didn't put on a high-pitched, sweet voice. He leaned his shoulder against the door frame, fighting the urge to gag as his pregnancy nausea warred with the heavy Enigma scents. He looked at the 4 miniature terrors, taking in their torn clothes and bruised knees. "Which one of you broke the bookshelf?" Jesse asked. His voice was flat, tired, and completely unimpressed. The boys stared at him. The one on the far left, clutching a broken wooden train, pointed silently at the tallest boy. "Snitch!" the tallest boy, Leo presumably, hissed. "Clean it up," Jesse said. Leo's eyes narrowed. He puffed out his small chest, trying to force another wave of aggressive pheromones, but it hit Jesse's biological shield and dissipated into nothing. Enigmas were built to dominate alphas and command omegas, but a pregnant omega was a biological anomaly. Jesse's body was entirely focused on protecting the life inside him. It simply rejected the dominance display. Jesse crossed his arms. "I'm not asking, kid. I'm pregnant, my feet swell, and I feel like I'm going to throw up. I'm not picking up your mess. Fix the shelf." Abner stood perfectly still, watching the exchange. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the climate control system. Then, slowly, Leo broke eye contact. He looked at the floor, muttered something unintelligible, and walked over to the heavy oak bookshelf. The other 3 boys quietly shuffled over to help him lift it. Abner let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. He looked at Jesse, a flicker of genuine shock in his slate eyes. "Don't look at me like that," Jesse muttered, rubbing his temple. "They're just kids. They smell like a short circuit, but they're just kids. Where's my room? I need to lie down before I puke on your expensive shoes." The bed in Jesse's assigned room was too soft. It was a massive, king-sized monstrosity draped in high-thread count Egyptian cotton that smelled faintly of industrial bleach. Jesse lay on his back, staring at the perfectly smooth ceiling. His spine ached, missing the firm, lumpy mattress of his old apartment. Dinner had been a masterclass in awkward silence. They had eaten at a dining table long enough to host a medieval banquet. Abner sat at one end, Jesse at the other, and the 4 boys lined up along the side, kicking the table legs and glaring at Jesse over their plates of unseasoned chicken and steamed broccoli. Jesse had barely eaten. The smell of the cooked poultry made his stomach roll. He had survived on dry toast and water, ignoring the burning stares of the quadruplets. Now, at 2 a.m., the house was dead quiet. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was tiny, sharp. Jesse rolled over, groaning softly as his lower back protested. He opened his eyes. Standing in the doorway of his bedroom, silhouetted by the dim hallway nightlight, was one of the boys. Toby. Jesse knew it was Toby, because Toby was the one who had spent all of dinner systematically ripping his napkin into microscopic shreds. Toby wasn't moving. He was just staring, his small hands clutching the hem of an oversized pajama shirt. He smelled faintly of ozone and distress, a sour, sharp undercurrent that pricked at Jesse's maternal instincts. Jesse didn't coo at him. He threw the heavy duvet off, shivering as the cold air hit his sweat-dampened t-shirt. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, planting his bare feet on the freezing hardwood. "What?" Jesse whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. Toby didn't answer. He just sniffled. His nose was running, wiping a wet streak across his pale cheek. Jesse sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "Are you sick or just creepy?" Toby scowled, the sadness momentarily replaced by Enigma pride. "Not creepy, thirsty." "Then get water." "Kitchen is dark," Toby muttered, looking away. "Too big." It was an admission of fear, a tiny, vulnerable crack in the terrifying Enigma facade. Jesse looked at the kid. He saw the tension in the boy's small shoulders, the way he was desperately trying not to cry. "Fine, Jesse grunted, standing up. He grabbed a thick woolen cardigan from the chair, wrapping it around his thin frame. Come on. He didn't offer his hand. Toby didn't ask for it. They walked down the cavernous hallway in silence, their uneven footsteps echoing in the dark. The kitchen was indeed massive and intimidating. The stainless steel appliances gleamed like surgical instruments in the moonlight spilling through the skylights. Jesse opened the massive commercial refrigerator, the harsh interior light flooding the space. He poured a glass of milk, his movements slow and deliberate. He slid it across the marble island to Toby. The boy climbed onto one of the high stools, gripping the glass with both hands. Thanks, Toby mumbled, taking a sip. Don't mention it, Jesse said. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his stomach. The baby was barely the size of a blueberry, but he felt the psychological weight of it anchoring him to the floor. Are you going to leave? Toby asked suddenly. His slate eyes were locked onto the glass of milk. Jesse paused. The raw honesty in the kid's voice caught him off guard. Why? You planning on breaking my arm? Leah wants to, Toby said matter-of-factly. He says you're just like the others, that you smell nice now, but you'll start crying later. Everyone cries. Jesse let out a short, cynical bark of laughter. Kid, I've been crying on the inside since 2018. A broken arm isn't going to make me run. I don't have anywhere to run to. Toby looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. You belong to Dad. I belong to a debt collector. Jesse corrected smoothly before catching himself. He shouldn't be unloading his trauma on a 5-year-old. He sighed, the scent of bitter orange flaring slightly to calm the sudden spike of anxiety in the room. Look, I'm not going anywhere. Your dad bought my debt. In exchange, I stay here and make sure you four don't set the house on fire. It's a business deal. We don't set fires, Toby said defensively. Sam tried once, but he didn't have a lighter. Good to know, Jesse deadpanned. A floorboard creaked behind them. Jesse didn't jump. The heavy scent of crushed cedar had been slowly filtering into the kitchen for the last minute. Abner stepped into the light. He was wearing sweatpants and a dark t-shirt, looking impossibly broad and intimidating, yet completely exhausted. Toby, Abner said softly. It's late. Toby hopped off the stool, leaving the half-empty glass on the counter. He didn't look at his father. He just walked past him, a tiny shadow disappearing into the dark hallway. Abner watched him go, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He stepped fully into the kitchen, the Enigma aura pressing against Jesse like a physical weight. Jesse stood his ground, letting his own pheromones rise to meet it, a stubborn, citrus-scented shield. He usually breaks glasses when he's awake at this hour, Abner noted, looking at the intact cup on the island. I told him I wasn't cleaning up his messes, Jesse said, turning to the sink to rinse his own water glass. Guess he believed me. Abner stepped closer. The proximity made Jesse's skin prickle. You handled him well. They are difficult to reach. They're not difficult, Abner, Jesse said, turning off the tap. He dried his hands on a towel, not looking at the older man. They're terrified. You live in a museum, not a house. You treat them like ticking time bombs instead of kids. No wonder they act like monsters. It's the only job description you gave them. The kitchen fell dead silent. It was a dangerous thing to say to an Enigma. An alpha would have flown into a rage. A beta would have backed down immediately. Jesse just stood there, clutching the damp towel, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Abner stared at him. The slate eyes were unreadable. Slowly, the overwhelming cedar scent began to recede, pulling back until it was just a faint, sad thrum in the air. I don't know how to be anything else, Abner admitted. The words were stripped of all power, raw and ugly in the quiet room. Their mother died giving birth to them. The Enigma genetics tore her apart. I look at them, and I see the things that killed her, and I see myself. I don't know how to fix it. Jesse swallowed the lump in his throat. He hated the vulnerability. He hated that this giant, terrifying man was just as broken and trapped as he was. It ruined the narrative. It made it harder to hate him. "You start by buying them a plastic cup," Jesse said quietly, tossing the towel onto the counter. "And maybe a rug that doesn't cost more than my college tuition. Good night, Mr. Freeman." Jesse walked past him, his shoulder brushing against Abner's arm. He felt a jolt of static electricity at the contact, a sudden jarring connection that made his breath catch. He didn't stop. He walked back to his cold, soft bed, the smell of cedar lingering on his skin long after he closed his eyes. Morning arrived with a harsh, unblinking glare through the uncurtained windows. Jesse woke with his cheek pressed against the cold mattress, his mouth tasting like old pennies and stomach acid. He barely made it to the ensuite bathroom before his knees hit the hexagonal floor tiles. He braced his forearms against the porcelain rim of the toilet, heaving until his ribs ached. There was nothing heroic about morning sickness. It was just wet, undignified misery. He stayed on the floor for 10 minutes, his cheek resting against the cool porcelain, waiting for the room to stop spinning. The pristine white bathroom offered no comfort. It felt like a hospital ward waiting for a patient. He dragged himself up, splashed freezing tap water onto his pale face, and aggressively brushed his teeth. His reflection in the mirror was a mess. Dark circles under his hazel eyes, limp brown hair, and a worn-out gray sweater that hung loosely over his frame. By the time he padded down the endless hallway, the house was already humming with that jagged, static electricity tension. Jesse paused at the kitchen archway. Abner was standing by the marble island. He was still wearing yesterday's slacks, though his dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and the sleeves were rolled up, exposing thick forearms dusted with dark hair. He was staring intensely at a brown cardboard box resting on his expensive countertops. The box had the bright red logo of a generic big box department store printed on the side. Abner reached in and pulled out a stack of brightly colored cheap plastic cups, neon green, harsh pink, blinding yellow. They looked completely absurd against the imported Italian marble. Jesse crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You actually went to a store." Abner didn't jump, but his shoulders stiffened. He set the cups down. "I had my assistant purchase them. I do not frequent retail establishments." "Obviously," Jesse murmured. He pushed off the wall and walked in, the heavy scent of crushed cedar wrapping around him. It was thicker this morning, underscored by a sharp note of frustration. Abner was stressed. "I also had a rug delivered," Abner stated, his voice a low rumble. "It is made of synthetic fibers. The manufacturer claims it is highly durable and stain-resistant. It is currently unrolled in the playroom." Jesse stopped halfway to the coffee maker. He looked at the billionaire. Abner looked entirely out of his element, a massive predator trying to understand the mechanics of a petting zoo. Jesse felt a sudden irritating twinge of sympathy. He ruthlessly stomped it out. Sympathy was dangerous. Sympathy made you care, and caring got you sold to settle a gambling debt. "Well, congratulations," Jesse deadpanned. "You're doing the bare minimum of parenting. Do you want a gold star?" Abner's slate eyes locked onto Jesse's. The Enigma aura flared, an instinctive crushing wave of dominance that commanded silence. It hit Jesse hard enough to make his breath catch, making the tiny hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But his biology reacted instantly. The scent of bitter orange and dry paper spilled from Jesse's skin, a heavy maternal counterweight that neutralized the aggression in the air. Abner blinked, the heavy pressure vanishing as quickly as it came. He looked away, rubbing his jaw. "I'm trying, Jesse." It was the first time Abner had used his first name. It sounded strange in that deep, gravelly voice, intimate, uncomfortable. Before Jesse could formulate a cynical response, a cacophony of footsteps echoed down the hall. The quadruplets arrived like a localized hurricane. Leo marched in first, glaring at the floorboards as if they had personally offended him. Sam and Wyatt were shoving each other, while Toby trailed behind, aggressively chewing on his thumbnail. The air instantly soured with the smell of raw, sparking wire. 4 little enigmas, already wound too tight. Leo marched up to the counter, expecting the usual heavy glass of imported mineral water the house staff normally left out. Instead, he found the neon pink plastic cup. He He stared at it. He poked it with one small finger. It tipped over, making a hollow thwack against the marble. "What is this?" Leo demanded, his small voice vibrating with an attempt at a growl. "It's a cup, genius," Jesse said, walking past him to grab a plain white mug from the cabinet. He poured himself a cup of hot water. Caffeine made him violently ill these days. "You drink out of it." "It's plastic," Sam piped up, squinting at the neon green one. "It's ugly." "It bounces," Jesse replied, taking a sip of his hot water. "Which means when you throw a tantrum and knock it off the table, it won't shatter into 1,000 pieces and make the housekeeper cry. Pick a color." Leo scowled, baring his small teeth. "I want the glass. I'm not a baby." Abner opened his mouth, the scent of cedar darkening with a warning. Jesse cut him off by slamming his mug down on the counter. The ceramic clattered loudly, startling all four boys. "Listen to me, Bite Size," Jesse said, pointing a finger directly at Leo's chest. "You act like a baby. You get baby cups. You want the glass? Prove you can go a whole week without breaking anything. Until then, you drink out of the pink plastic." Leo's eyes widened. He looked at Abner, waiting for his father to step in and crush this insubordinate Omega. Abner just stood there, his hands resting on the edge of the island, watching Jesse with an unreadable expression. When no defense came, Leo's shoulders slumped the tiniest fraction. The aggressive ozone scent in the room fractured, turning confused. Grumbling under his breath, Leo snatched the pink cup. Wyatt grabbed the yellow, Sam the green. Toby, who had been quiet the entire time, slowly reached out and took the blue one. He looked up at Jesse, his slate eyes wide. "Can I have milk?" "Yeah, kid," Jesse sighed, the tension draining out of his spine. "You can have milk." He poured the milk, ignoring the intense, unwavering stare Abner was aiming at the back of his head. Jesse's stomach gave another hollow, rolling ache. It was going to be a very long pregnancy. 2 weeks blurred into a monotonous, nauseating routine. Jesse learned the rhythm of the fortress. The house staff moved like ghosts, cleaning and repairing the boys' destruction with terrified efficiency. Abner was a phantom, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, locking himself in his study. The Quadruplets were a relentless force of nature, testing Jesse's patience with screaming matches, bitten furniture, and aggressive dominance displays that bounced uselessly off his pregnancy hormones. The physical toll was getting worse. Jesse's jeans no longer buttoned comfortably. A small, firm bump had pushed its way into existence. His lower back screamed by mid-afternoon, and his sense of smell had dialed up to an excruciating level. He could smell the synthetic lemon cleaner 3 rooms away. He could smell the lingering scent of Rogelio's cheap beer in his nightmares. And he could smell Abner. Abner's scent was everywhere. It clung to the upholstery, soaked into the carpets, and drifted through the vents, crushed cedar and incoming storms. It should have been terrifying. It was an Enigma's territorial marker. But to Jesse's hormone-addled brain, it just smelled like safety. It was a Tuesday afternoon. A cold autumn rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the playroom. The boys were asleep. Jesse had miraculously managed to exhaust them by instituting a mandatory run up and down the hallway until you drop game. Jesse sat on the ugly, highly durable synthetic rug Abner had bought. It was scratchy and smelled like a chemical factory, but it was thick enough to cushion his aching joints. He leaned his back against the base of the heavy leather sofa. He was shivering. The climate control was set to a crisp 68 degrees, perfect for Enigmas who ran hot, but freezing for a pregnant Omega. Without thinking, Jesse reached out. Sam had left a thick wool sweater on the floor. Jesse pulled it into his lap. It smelled like raw wire and boyish sweat. Next to it was Wyatt's discarded fleece blanket. Jesse grabbed that too. His brain felt foggy, wrapped in a thick layer of instinct. He needed warmth. He needed a barrier. He needed a nest. He crawled on his hands and knees, ignoring the twinge in his back. He found a throw pillow. He found a jacket Leo had left by the door. Then he found a heavy dark gray cashmere scarf draped over a chair. It belonged to Abner. The cedar scent practically vibrated off the fabric, thick and grounding. Jesse dragged the pile back to the corner behind the sofa. He arranged the clothes in a semicircle, his hands moving with frantic, thoughtless precision. He tucked the fleece blanket into the base, lined the sides with the boys' sweaters, and pulled Abner's cashmere scarf over his own head like a cowl. The moment the cedar scent enveloped his face, his lungs expanded. A heavy, drug-like wave of relief crashed over him. The bitter orange peel scent pouring off his own skin sweetened, turning warm and heavy, mixing with the cedar and ozone, until the corner of the room smelled like a strange, chaotic forest. Jesse curled into a tight ball in the center of the pile, his hands resting protectively over his small stomach. His eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in weeks, the nausea faded. He slept. He didn't know how much time passed. A sharp, vibrating growl woke him. Jesse gasped, his eyes flying open. The room was dark, lit only by the gray ambient light of the rainstorm outside. Standing over him were the quadruplets. All four boys were awake, their small bodies rigid, their eyes wide and completely black, their pupils blown wide in biological shock. They were staring at the pile of clothes. "You stole my sweater," Leo hissed, but there was no real aggression in it. It was confusion, deep, fundamental confusion. Omegas didn't nest with Enigma scents. Enigmas were too abrasive, too dominant. It was biologically contradictory. Before Jesse could untangle his limbs and explain, a shadow filled the doorway. Abner stepped into the playroom. He had clearly just gotten home. His dark wool overcoat was damp with rain, and his tie was pulled loose. He froze the moment he crossed the threshold. The air pressure in the room plummeted. Abner's eyes locked onto the corner behind the sofa. He saw Jesse, curled up, wrapped in his son's clothes and wearing his cashmere scarf. The Enigma reaction was immediate, violent, and entirely instinctual. Abner let out a low, chest-rattling sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a purr. It was the sound of a predator recognizing something that belonged to it. The scent of crushed cedar exploded in the room, no longer smelling of frustration or exhaustion. It smelled dark, possessive, overwhelming. "Dad?" Toby whimpered, taking a step back. Abner didn't look at his sons. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, falling to his knees right at the edge of the makeshift nest. His massive hands gripped the edge of the leather sofa, his knuckles turning white. Jesse scrambled backward, his back hitting the wall. Panic sliced through the lingering sleep fog. He felt a hot flush of absolute mortification. He was a 24-year-old man, sitting in a pile of stolen laundry, being cornered by a billionaire. "I'm sorry," Jesse blurted out, his voice cracking. He tried to yank the scarf off his head, but his trembling fingers got caught in the fine wool. "I didn't mean to. I was just cold. And the hormones, I wasn't trying to touch your things, I swear. I'll wash it. Stop." Abner's voice was a harsh rasp, dropping a full octave. Jesse froze. Abner leaned forward. He didn't touch Jesse, but he was close enough that Jesse could feel the heat radiating off the man's damp overcoat. Abner closed his eyes and took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the thick mixture of cedar, ozone, and warm orange peels. When Abner opened his eyes, the bruised slate color was entirely swallowed by blown-out black pupils. "You are nesting with our scents," Abner whispered, the words sounding torn from his throat. "It's just biology," Jesse said defensively, wrapping his arms around his waist. He was trying to sound cynical, trying to rebuild his usual armor, but his voice shook. "It doesn't mean anything." Abner looked down at Jesse's hands, resting protectively over the small bump. The tension in Abner's broad shoulders tightened until it looked painful. "Do not wash the scarf," Abner ordered, his voice raw. He stood up abruptly, stepping back as if physical distance was the only way to maintain control. He looked at his 4 sons who were watching the exchange with wide, silent eyes. "Leo, Take your brothers to the kitchen. Have the chef make soup. Now." The boys didn't argue. They practically scrambled out of the room, leaving Jesse alone with the Enigma. Abner didn't say another word. He stared at Jesse for a long, agonizing moment, the air thick with unresolved tension and heavy pheromones. Then he turned and walked out, closing the heavy playroom door with a soft, definitive click. Jesse sat in the pile of clothes, pulling the cashmere scarf tighter around his neck. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm. He was sold to pay a debt, hired to be a biological pacifier. It was a business deal. But as he sat in the dark, breathing in the scent of crushed cedar, Jesse realized with a cold spike of dread that his body was already deciding this fortress was home. Breakfast was an exercise in avoiding eye contact. Morning sunlight filtered harshly through the dining room windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the massive mahogany table. Jesse sat at his usual end, pushing a forkful of dry, scrambled eggs around his plate. He was 14 weeks along now. The small firmness in his abdomen had rounded out into a noticeable bump, forcing him to abandon his jeans entirely in favor of soft, oversized sweatpants. His back ached with a dull, constant throb. The cashmere scarf was wrapped securely around his neck, despite the house being perfectly climate-controlled. He hadn't taken it off in 3 weeks. Down the length of the table, Abner sat scrolling through a tablet. The billionaire was wearing a crisp charcoal suit, projecting absolute authority, yet the heavy scent of crushed cedar leaking into the room was laced with a strange, hesitant anxiety. Every few minutes, Abner's slate eyes would flick up, land on the scarf wrapped around Jesse's throat, and dart back down to the screen. The quadruplets were unusually quiet. They were eating plain oatmeal out of their neon plastic cups, a bizarre compromise Jesse had forced on the kitchen staff to prevent the daily shattered porcelain routines. Suddenly, a metallic clatter shattered the silence. Jesse blinked, looking down. A slightly mangled heavy silver soup spoon was resting next to his plate. It had deep, unmistakable teeth marks denting the handle. Sam was standing by Jesse's chair, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The boy's dark hair was sticking up in every direction, and he smelled faintly of static electricity and wet earth. He didn't say a word. He just pushed the ruined spoon an inch closer to Jesse's plate with a sticky finger, then sprinted back to his own seat. Jesse stared at the piece of silverware. "What is this?" "It's shiny," Toby muttered around a mouthful of oatmeal. "Dad said we aren't allowed to bite the furniture anymore," Leo added, crossing his arms and glaring at the centerpiece vase. "So Sam bites the spoons, but that one is the best one. It's the heaviest." Jesse's brain short-circuited. He looked from the chewed-up spoon to the boys, then down the table to Abner. Abner was rubbing the bridge of his nose, looking profoundly exhausted, but he didn't intervene. It was an offering, a deeply feral Enigma pup offering. They were giving the pregnant Omega the best, shiniest piece of their hoard. A tight, uncomfortable knot formed in Jesse's throat. He wanted to roll his eyes. He wanted to deliver a sarcastic quip about tetanus and proper dental hygiene. Instead, his traitorous biology surged, releasing a thick wave of bitter orange and dry paper that flooded the dining room with absolute, suffocating approval. The boys instantly relaxed, their narrow shoulders dropping as the maternal pheromones washed over them. Jesse picked up the dented spoon, sliding it into the pocket of his sweatpants. "Thanks, kid," he grunted, his voice slightly rough. "I'll put it in the nest." Abner's head snapped up. The tablet hit the table with a sharp smack. Jesse froze, realizing what he had just admitted out loud. He hadn't meant to call it a nest. He had dragged the scratchy synthetic rug into the corner of his bedroom, piling it high with stolen hoodies, the boys' discarded blankets, and Abner's scarf. He slept curled up in it every night like a pathetic, instinct-driven animal, abandoning the king-sized mattress entirely. The air in the room thickened. Abner's pupils dilated, the bruised slate expanding into pitch black. The scent of incoming storms rolled through the dining room, heavy and possessive. "You moved the rug," Abner said. It wasn't a question. The rumble of his voice vibrated against Jesse's sternum. "The mattress is too soft," Jesse snapped back, instantly defensive. He crossed his arms over his bump, hiding behind a wall of cynicism. "My back hurts. The floor is better. Don't read into it." "Leo," Abner commanded, not breaking eye contact with Jesse. "Take your brothers to the playroom, now." The boys didn't hesitate. The absolute authority in their father's tone sent them scrambling out of the room, their neon cups left abandoned on the mahogany wood. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, the silence became deafening. Abner stood up. He didn't approach Jesse, which was a small mercy. He walked over to a sideboard, poured hot water from a silver carafe into a ceramic mug, and set a small tea bag inside. He carried the mug down the length of the table, stopping 3 feet from Jesse. He set it down. "Peppermint," Abner said quietly. "My assistant researched remedies for omega morning sickness. It is supposed to settle the stomach." Jesse stared at the steaming liquid. The sharp, clean smell of mint cut through the heavy cedar in the room, offering immediate relief to his rolling nausea. He looked up at the Enigma. Abner was a ruthless syndicate boss who bought people to settle debts. Yet here he stood, making herbal tea and allowing his children to gnaw on priceless silverware just to keep the peace. "I don't need you to fix me," Jesse muttered, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "I am not attempting to fix you," Abner replied, his voice a low, rough scrape. "I am attempting to maintain your health. A medical team will be arriving at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Dr. Harrison is the syndicate's private physician. He will be performing your second trimester ultrasound." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Jesse's chest. Medical teams meant reality. It meant looking at the screen and seeing Rogelio's mistake, the $50,000 debt currently taking up residence behind his ribs. "I can go to a normal clinic," Jesse said, his knuckles turning white on the mug. "No," Abner stated, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "You are carrying under my roof. You belong to this household. You will receive the highest standard of care, and it will be done here, where it is safe." Jesse swallowed hard, tasting bile and mint. He wanted to argue, to demand his independence, but the heavy protective cedar scent wrapping around him was violently intoxicating. He hated it. He hated how much his body craved it. "Fine," Jesse whispered, dropping his gaze to the chewed-up spoon peeking out of his pocket. 2 o'clock. Machines beeped in a steady, irritating rhythm inside the East Wing's guest suite, which had been ruthlessly converted into a sterile medical bay overnight. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and cold linoleum, completely overriding the house's usual static charge. Jesse lay flat on an examination table, the thin paper crinkling noisily under his weight. He was shivering. His sweatpants were pushed down low on his hips, and his gray t-shirt was bunched up under his armpits, exposing his pale, rounded stomach to the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Harrison was a beta. He was a balding, middle-aged man with expensive wire-rimmed glasses and a distinct sheen of sweat completely covering his forehead. The doctor was terrified. It wasn't because of Jesse. It was because Abner Freeman was standing directly behind the medical equipment, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The Enigma hadn't spoken a word since the examination began, but his pheromones were completely out of control. The room felt like the inside of a pressure cooker. "All right, Mr. Cavalier," Dr. Harrison said, his voice trembling slightly. He held up a bottle of clear acoustic gel. "This is going to be cold." Jesse squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself. The gel hit his skin like liquid ice. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. Instantly, a low, warning growl ripped through the room. Dr. Harrison froze, his hand hovering an inch above Jesse's stomach. The beta looked like he was about to pass out. Jesse opened his eyes, glaring past the doctor at the billionaire. "Abner, stop it. He has to use the gel. Back off before you give the poor man a heart attack." Abner's jaw tightened. The dark slate eyes were fixed on the ultrasound probe in the doctor's trembling hand. He didn't apologize. but he took one slow half-step backward, reining in the suffocating pressure just enough for Dr. Harrison to remember how to breathe. Proceeding, the doctor stammered, pressing the plastic wand into Jesse's skin. Jesse stared at the ceiling tiles. He refused to look at the monitor. He dug his fingernails into the vinyl padding of the exam table. This was Rogelio's child. Rogelio, who had gambled away their rent money. Rogelio, who smelled like stale beer and broken promises. This baby was a biological anchor to a man who had sold him to a holding company like a used car. "There we are," Dr. Harrison murmured, typing frantically on the keyboard. Then he flipped a switch. Whoosh thump. Whoosh thump. Whoosh thump. The sound filled the sterile room. It was impossibly fast, a frantic rhythmic drumming of life echoing through the tiny speakers. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. The cynical wall he had spent 4 years building cracked right down the middle. He tried to hold it back. He really did. But a hot, humiliating tear slipped out of the corner of his eye, tracing a wet path into his hairline. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, trying to stifle the ragged gasp tearing up his throat. It was a person. It wasn't a debt. It was a fast, strong, living heartbeat. Suddenly, a massive, calloused hand wrapped around Jesse's ankle. Jesse gasped, his head snapping to the side. Abner had moved. The Enigma was standing right at the edge of the exam table. He wasn't looking at the monitor. He was looking down at Jesse. His grip on Jesse's ankle wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it was completely immovable. It was heavy, grounding, and burned with heat. The scent of crushed cedar spiked, washing away the clinical smell of rubbing alcohol. It didn't smell like a threat. It smelled like an absolute, violent promise of protection. It was an Enigma claiming a pup that wasn't his, purely on instinct. "Strong," Abner rumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heartbeat is strong." Jesse couldn't speak. He just nodded, staring at Abner's hand on his skin. He was terrified of how safe it made him feel. Dr. Harrison rapidly wiped the freezing gel off Jesse's stomach with a rough paper towel. "Everything looks completely viable, Mr. Freeman. 14th week of gestation. Omega stress levels seem adequately managed given the environment." Before Abner could respond, a sharp, vibrating buzz broke the moment. Abner's hand jerked away from Jesse's ankle. He pulled a sleek black phone from his suit pocket. He glanced at the screen, and the gentle, protective Enigma vanished in a fraction of a second. The man who answered the phone was the syndicate boss. Abner turned his back, pacing toward the far corner of the room. He didn't bother leaving. He simply assumed no one would dare eavesdrop, but Jesse's hearing was heightened, hyper-tuned to the alpha predator in his space. "I don't care what the Port Authority said," Abner spoke into the receiver. His voice was completely dead, stripped of all emotion. It sounded like grinding ice. "If he defaults on the shipment, you take the warehouse. If he resists, break his knees. I want the deed on my desk by morning." Jesse sat up, pulling his t-shirt down over his stomach. The phantom warmth of Abner's hand on his ankle suddenly felt like a brand. Dr. Harrison was frantically packing his equipment, his eyes glued to the floor, pretending he hadn't heard a billionaire order a man crippled over a delayed shipment. Jesse swung his legs off the side of the table. He looked at Abner's broad back, encased in the expensive charcoal suit. The contradiction was jarring, sickeningly sharp. This man had just softly praised his baby's heartbeat after buying Jesse like property. This man made herbal tea and ordered shattered kneecaps in the same breath. Abner ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. When he turned around, the icy syndicate boss receded, replaced once again by the exhausted father. "I have to return to the city," Abner said, his eyes flicking to Jesse's pale face. "Leo and the boys are in the West Wing with the tutor. Do not hesitate to call the staff if you require anything." "Sure," Jesse muttered, avoiding Abner's gaze. He hopped off the table, his bare feet hitting the cold floor. "Have fun breaking legs, Abner." Abner froze. The heavy Enigma pheromone stuttered. For a second, a flash of genuine, ugly shame crossed the billionaire's face. He opened his mouth to speak, to justify it, to say something, but he stopped. He simply gave a curt nod and walked out of the room, leaving Jesse alone in the sterile silence. Jesse leaned against the examination table, wrapping his arms around his stomach. He was living in a cage wrapped in gold and cashmere. The terrifying part wasn't the monster who owned the cage. The terrifying part was that Jesse's biology was desperately begging him to lock the door from the inside. Winter hit the sprawling estate overnight. Frost crawled up the reinforced glass of the foyer windows, trapping the house in a thick, white glare. Inside, the heating vents pushed dry, artificially warmed air through the massive corridors, carrying with it the sterile scent of floor polish and the ever-present grounding thrum of Abner's crushed cedar. Jesse was 22 weeks along. His center of gravity had shifted entirely, forcing him to walk with a slight backward lean, a hand constantly resting on the heavy, solid curve of his stomach. His joints ached. His feet were swollen inside a pair of Abner's discarded wool socks. He was in the kitchen, carefully slicing a green apple, when the scent hit him. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It seeped under the heavy front doors like toxic sludge, sour beer, stale tobacco, and the sharp, pathetic tang of unwashed fear. Rogelio. The paring knife slipped, nicking Jesse's thumb. He didn't feel the sting. A cold, suffocating panic clamped around his throat, stealing his oxygen. His Omega biology screamed, instantly flooding the kitchen with a distress signal, burnt orange peels and rotting paper. A heavy crash echoed from the front foyer. Jesse dropped the knife. He wiped his bleeding thumb on his sweatpants and walked blindly toward the noise. In the massive entryway, two of Abner's private security guards had a man pinned face down against the imported Italian marble. Rogelio Bell was thrashing, his cheap denim jacket riding up, his boots scuffing the floor. He looked exactly the same as the day he abandoned Jesse. Unkempt, desperate, and sweating profusely, Abner stood over him. The Enigma wasn't wearing a suit today, just a dark sweater and slacks, but he looked like a towering monument to violence. The air in the foyer was physically heavy. Abner's pupils were blown completely black, radiating a territorial fury so thick it made the security guards visibly flinch. "You didn't say he was knocked up!" Rogelio shouted, his voice muffled by the floor. He craned his neck, spotting Jesse standing in the hallway archway. "Jesse, tell him that's my kid. He owes me a higher payout for a bred Omega." The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. Jesse's hands shook. He expected to cry. He expected the cynical armor he wore to shatter, leaving him a sobbing, pathetic mess. But as he looked at Rogelio, at the man who had sold him to cover a string of bad bets, he felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, scraping disgust. Before Abner could order the guards to break Rogelio's neck, a chaotic flurry of footsteps thundered down the main staircase. The Quadruplets arrived. They didn't act like human children. They moved like a coordinated pack of feral animals. Leo took the lead, his bare feet slapping against the marble. Toby, Sam, and Wyatt flanked him, their small chests heaving. They hit the bottom of the stairs and instantly caught the scent of Rogelio's threat, mingling with Jesse's burnt orange distress. Leo didn't scream. He dropped into a low crouch, placing himself directly between Rogelio and Jesse. The 5-year-old bared his teeth, and a sound ripped from his throat that defied his size, a vibrating, chest-deep Enigma snarl. Sam and Wyatt flanked Jesse's legs, grabbing fistfuls of his sweatpants, growling in eerie unison. Toby stepped right in front of Jesse's swollen stomach, crossing his small arms and glaring at the man on the floor with lethal, bruised slate eyes. Rogelio froze, staring at the miniature monsters guarding his ex-Omega. "What the hell are those?" "They're my kids," Jesse said. His voice was dead calm. He didn't recognize it. The burnt orange scent completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating heavy blanket of maternal defense. It was dominant, pushing against Abner's violent cedar, demanding control of the room. Abner looked at Jesse, the pitch black of his eyes flickering back to slate gray as the Omega pheromones grounded him. The billionaire stepped back, yielding the floor to Jesse. Jesse walked forward, his gait heavy and slow. He stopped 2 feet away from Rogelio's head. "I don't belong to you," Jesse stated, staring down at the pathetic alpha. "I never did. You sold me to clear 50 grand. You don't get to come back here and demand a higher price tag for a baby you would have left in a dumpster anyway." "Jesse, come on," Rogelio wheezed, straining against a guard's knee. "He's a syndicate boss. He's going to kill you. I'm trying to rescue you." "You're trying to extort him," Jesse corrected flatly. He looked up at Abner. "Get him out of my house. If I ever smell him again, I won't stop your kids from biting him." Abner's chest rumbled. It was a purr, a deep, terrifyingly dark sound of absolute approval. He gave a sharp nod to the guards. "Drag him off the property," Abner ordered, his voice grinding like ice. "If he steps within a 5-mile radius of this estate again, bury him under it." The guards hauled Rogelio up by his armpits, dragging him kicking and screaming through the heavy mahogany doors. The cold winter air rushed in for a brief second before the doors slammed shut, cutting off Rogelio's frantic begging. Silence descended on the foyer. Jesse stood there, his shoulders suddenly slumping as the adrenaline crashed. He felt a tug on his sweatpants. He looked down. Leo was staring up at him, the feral aggression completely gone, replaced by a tentative, quiet concern. "Did he hurt you?" Leo asked, his small voice echoing in the massive space. Jesse swallowed hard. He reached out, resting a trembling hand on Leo's messy dark hair. "No, kid, he didn't." Abner crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his massive arms around Jesse, pulling him flush against his chest. Jesse's face pressed into the thick wool of Abner's sweater. The overwhelming scent of cedar and incoming storms wrapped around him, completely erasing the lingering stench of stale beer. For the first time in his life, Jesse closed his eyes and simply let someone else hold him up. Firelight flickered against the sterile white walls of the master study, casting long, dancing shadows across the hardwood floor. Outside, the winter wind howled, battering the thick glass, but inside, the room was stiflingly warm. Jesse sat on the floor. He hadn't moved his makeshift nest from the bedroom, but he had dragged a heavy fleece blanket into Abner's office, claiming the spot directly in front of the hearth. He sat cross-legged, a mug of lukewarm peppermint tea resting on his swollen belly. Abner sat in his heavy leather desk chair, holding a thick manila folder. He had been staring at it for 20 minutes. The Enigma looked exhausted, the gray at his temples seeming more prominent in the firelight. "You said my house." Abner finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the crackle of burning logs. Jesse took a slow sip of his tea. "I was making a point. Don't let it go to your head." Abner stood up. He didn't walk around the desk. He walked directly toward the fireplace, lowering his massive frame until he was sitting on the hardwood floor right next to Jesse's blanket. He opened the folder. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on heavy, expensive paper. "This is the debt transfer agreement," Abner said, pulling out the top document. It had Jesse's forged signature at the bottom, right next to Rogelio's hasty scrawl. Without a trace of hesitation, Abner tossed it directly into the roaring fire. Jesse gasped, lunging forward slightly, but Abner caught his shoulder with a gentle, firm hand. They both watched the thick paper curl, turn black, and disintegrate into floating ash. "What are you doing?" Jesse whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Removing the transaction," Abner replied. He pulled a second stack of papers from the folder, resting them on his knee. He handed a heavy gold-plated pen to Jesse. "These are emancipation and trust documents. They legally declare that you have no financial obligations to me, my holding company, or my syndicate. Furthermore, it establishes a trust fund for your child, fully funded, securing their medical care and education through adulthood." Jesse stared at the pen in his hand. The metal was cold. It felt incredibly heavy. He looked at the documents, then up at Abner. "You're kicking me out." "I'm giving you a choice," Abner corrected, his slate eyes boring into Jesse's. The crushing Enigma aura was completely absent. Abner was forcefully suppressing his own biology, refusing to influence Jesse's decision. You were forced into this house because of another man's cowardice. You stayed because my sons are chaotic and my parenting is deeply flawed. You buy them neon plastic cups now, Jesse muttered, his voice cracking slightly. That's progress. Jesse, Abner said, the rough scrape of his voice betraying a terrifying vulnerability. I am a ruthless man. I order violence to maintain my territory. I live in a fortress because I have enemies. This is not a fairy tale. I know that, Jesse snapped, wiping a frustratingly wet tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. I grew up eating cereal for dinner and hiding from landlords. I don't believe in fairy tales. I believe in what's right in front of me. Then look at what is in front of you, Abner urged, leaning closer. The scent of crushed cedar wrapped around Jesse, warm and desperate. If you sign those papers and walk out that door, you will never have to worry about money or safety again. You will be free. Jesse looked down at the trust documents. It was everything he had ever wanted. It was freedom. It was a clean slate. He could take his baby and go build a quiet, safe life somewhere far away from syndicates, broken kneecaps, and feral Enigma toddlers. He thought about the quiet. He thought about waking up without the smell of static electricity and ozone. He thought about drinking out of a normal glass instead of a neon green cup. He thought about sleeping in a perfectly soft bed without a scratchy synthetic rug or a stolen cashmere scarf. It sounded agonizingly lonely. Jesse dropped the gold pen onto the floor. It rolled away, disappearing under the edge of the fleece blanket. I'm keeping the plastic cups, Jesse said softly. Abner's breath hitched. The massive man froze, completely paralyzed by the words. And I'm not moving the rug, Jesse continued, turning his body to face the Enigma. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he grasped the lapel of Abner's dark sweater. Your kids are terrors. Your house looks like a sterilized morgue, and you smell like a lumberjack caught in a hurricane. Jesse, Abner breathed out, dropping the folder onto the floor. I'm not property, Jesse said fiercely, pulling Abner down by the sweater until their foreheads rested against each other. I'm not a transaction. I'm a partner. If I stay, it's because I choose to, because you need me to fix your depressing house, and I need to be here. Abner's hands came up, massive and trembling, framing Jesse's pale face. The Enigma didn't push his dominance. He didn't claim Jesse with a violent surge of pheromones. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that smelled of cedar and absolute devastating devotion. You are my partner, Abner murmured against Jesse's lips. You are the only real thing in this house. When Abner kissed him, it wasn't a romance novel cliché. It was clumsy. Their noses bumped. Jesse's heavy stomach pressed awkwardly against Abner's thigh, and Abner was terrified of pressing too hard. But it grounded Jesse completely. It tasted like peppermint tea and felt like the safest place on earth. They broke apart when the study door creaked open. 4 small heads poked into the room. Toby was clutching a chewed-up silver spoon. Are you leaving? Leo asked, his voice entirely devoid of its usual bravado, shrinking back into the hallway. Jesse laughed, a real, cynical, breathless sound. He leaned his back against Abner's chest, feeling the solid, heavy heartbeat of the billionaire thumping against his spine. Abner's arms wrapped securely around Jesse's waist, settling naturally over the baby bump. No, bite size, Jesse said, waving them in. Get in here. The floor is cold. The 4 boys practically scrambled into the room, diving onto the fleece blanket in a chaotic tangle of limbs, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Jesse rested his head back against Abner's shoulder, inhaling the deep, chaotic scent of his imperfect feral family. He was sold to pay a debt, but Jesse Cavalier had absolutely no intention of ever asking for a refund. If you felt the raw, unfiltered reality of Jesse's journey and his deeply imperfect struggle to find a place in Abner's chaotic world, let us know. Did Jesse's grounded, no-nonsense attitude resonate with you? Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how these broken pieces might slowly fit together. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow Omegaverse drama fans, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell so you won't miss the emotional twists in the next parts of their story.